Hmm. So David, hello, and thank you for accepting our invitation to join this very informal conversation about the project, of which you're more or less familiar with already, but I will just try to outline a few of the propositions that we have and a few of the initial hypotheses of the project, just to head start the conversation. As you know, the Former West project tries to look at this particular condition of the construction of the West from multiple angles. That each of them implies a different but nonetheless overlapping definition of like what the West was. And the first such understanding of the West that we tackled, I mean, in the first Congress and sort of like in the initial phases of the project, was the one that was based on the year 1989, implying thus that the West that is being put under pressure and is being regarded not as a fixed, continuous entity, but as one under transformation and one subjected to a process of even to a certain decay. I mean, this is to be said. I mean, even if that is a partial phenomenon, even that is implied in the project, both as a reality on the ground that is being analyzed, but also as a political proposition to be achieved. So this implied the West of the Cold War logics. But of course, this West overlaps with different understandings of the West that sort of mark the history of this continent and of the world for many more centuries. Of course, one thing that needs to be mentioned is that, of course, these different definitions are not completely separate. That in the construction of the Cold War West, of the Cold War logics of the West, that West was not only the clear definition of those societies that had the capitalist system as their prime economic model, and liberal democracy as the prime political model, but it also carried a number of relics with them, a certain understanding of a certain allure of the term West that came from its colonial past, that came from a certain imperial preeminence, that probably like went even further in sort of like in a certain understanding of like Christian divisions. And all this need to be taken into account when we analyze the last 2 decades, which is the period that is of prime interest in the project, and this period of where the formerness of the Cold War West occurs, but in the same time sheds perhaps a stronger light on the formerness of the other Wests somehow, and sort of like illuminate certain processes that have been taking place even before the year 89. And even if we look at this particular 89 moment, of course there are different other coordinates that we're trying to look at, and one of them was trying to identify a useful periodization after the year 89, so looking both at September 11 as possible dates and the start of the economic crisis, but of course we should also like try to imagine such working hypotheses, working dates even before, and of course like the year 1979 or whatever date you want to pick around it, the moment of the beginning of like the neoliberal revolution, as many people would put it today, or some people would put it today, some influential people. If that date is not somehow even more relevant than 89 for the same realities that we're actually like looking at. And I don't know, like to turn this to you a bit and to ask you, how do you see this, and how do you relate to this hypothesis?
Well, I think maybe one thing one should start with is this whole category of the West, and actually where does it emerge? How does one see it? And I think anything I will say will be defined by a kind of stereoscopy. On the one hand, when you're living in a place like Russia, I'm sure that, you know, in the late 80s and early 90s, when you were living in Romania, it's a similar thing. Yeah, it's the West somewhere there. There's absolutely nothing former about it, actually. In the 90s, and not even now, the West is there, it exists, and it's this monolith. In some ways, very similar to how power is defined. Yeah, so it's always power that's the power. Yeah, the state, meaning the state, is always to blame when the lights go out, and the West is there to fulfill some kind of dreams. It's this monolithic thing. This is how it's used in everyday language, and that's been that way actually since the 60s, at least. Yeah, it's been that. It used to be Europe, also the West. Yeah, in Russia there was this whole idea of the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. I mean, you know all this stuff. But we have a certain historical construct that intensifies in a moment, at the time of the Cold War, where the West also begins to present itself as the West, where the West becomes a brand, even a cigarette brand, for an example, you know, that then in 1989 is held up very, you know, as the kind of symbol of the transformation that you're talking about. Very bad cigarettes, and they were actually almost as bad as Magma cigarettes, which were the NATO brand that was then flooding the Russian market. I was in Russia for the first time in 1993 when all of this was happening, and I remember that I was always seen as a representative of the West. I never knew what this meant, and I was very happy one time when I heard, I don't know, on the radio or on television, a quote of Josef Brodsky, who, you know, said, there is, you know, when I came to the so-called West, I realized that it is actually a multiplicity, and this is what you were talking about, that there is no such thing. I think that in Russia, maybe there has been, and in the former East, there has been a kind of transformation of thinking that people actually do realize this, and that concept, that monolithic concept, has indeed, to a degree, eroded. On the other hand, you know, if anything, I mean, if you read the media and if you talk to people who aren't inside an intellectual context, obviously the outside still very much exists. It's still very much an outside. And, you know, power is still a monolith, and so on. So I think these erosions that you're talking about are things that happen in very localized discourses, and I think we should realize that. I think we should realize that these things, of course, you know, there is no such thing as a monolithic West, perhaps, to begin, but on the other hand, that monolith is still operating. So how do we work in that situation? Just to finish this train of thought, what I think is very interesting is actually that the things that this cigarette ad type West that you would see as monolithic, the place where you see it the most clearly is actually the former West. The places where the West went when it became former, to use your rhetoric and to appropriate your rhetoric. The places where the West is universalized. So we see actually in a much more strong, a much stronger, a much more precise, focused form some of the things that actually make this Westernness. For an example, you know, capitalism as such, and capitalism as the kind of Las Vegas capitalism, the capitalism of burning neon lights that never go out, the capitalism of, you know, huge Rolls Royces and people wearing gold. You wouldn't, of course, see that in the former West, which is now very decent and petit bourgeois, but you would see this really haute bourgeois, massive kind of display of wealth in those very places where there is, that are not the West.
In the same way as like the acme of the ideological construction of the victorious West, the sort of Reaganite kind of neoliberalism is more to be found in this the spaces of the former West, as you speak, much more than the former West itself.
But that's the strange thing, is that to me it sounds very strange to hear this construction in general, because as I say, there's nothing former. The West was always an image, and its image has somehow become stronger with its universalization. I think that the formerness is a kind of self-deception of the actual West, which is now pretending that it has ceded its hegemony, when actually that may not, culturally at least, be so much the case. Knowing, as somebody who's working in the former West, to implement the West, so to speak, I find this a doubtful construction.
There are a few aspects here. I mean, on one hand, of course, the perception of the West, and the self-perception of it, and the perception, the different perceptions it had outside of the West, is a very important component of this equation. And this is perhaps the aspect that is from certain points of view the most obvious one that has been transformed. But we're also talking about very clear realities, about a very clear structure of hegemony, about a very clear location of power, both economic and political, that has been associated with the same countries that produced this, that were also the factories for this image as well. I mean, there has been like this overlap. And there is a process of dislocation on different fronts. On the front of this image, on the front of like the culture of the West, on the image of the perception of it, and on the front of the actual power. But of course, these dislocations are different, and they manifest, like with different durations and with like different degrees of like synchronization. And we are in this process of like major dislocations, of like entanglement, as our guest at the first former West Congress, Arat Maharaj, put it. And we find different paradigms that one, in terms of cultural or vernacular paradigms that you would associate with the West, that are being produced by, for, and in spaces of the non-West, of the former West, as you also called it.
Yeah, no, it's
and
it's
you also like, for
formulation,
sure, but as you brought it into the discussion. Although former West, I mean, the rest, of course, is a former, but former West is.
I think it was used at the conference you've been referring.
Now, of course, you have like centers of military, of economic power that are articulated outside the West and are, unlike the division of the Cold War, are articulated in a way that is much more prone to be sort of like placed in a network of power that you would label as a non-geographic West as well.
Yes.
But basically, all this, I mean, this very complex and perhaps difficult to grasp, and certainly difficult to put into one image or one formulation situation of the world today, clearly indicates that on one hand there is a very clear reality of a notion of the West and of the West on several levels, and that on all these levels there is a transformation, there is a process of becoming in one way or another.
Okay, but I would try to maybe go from this, it's a very convenient and nice, and I mean, as I told you just now, I totally relate to this idea of a multiple West that is then made into a monolith, then begins to see itself as less monolithic and so forth. I mean, these are all ideological moments. But maybe if we move away from this and really refocus around the question of what is actually changing over the last 20 years after, I mean, we're obviously talking about a key event, which is the collapse of 20th century socialism. Why not try to focus a little bit on those changes without actually, getting too much into the metaphysics of belatedness and formerness? Because I have a feeling that actually that's part of the changes that were taking place after 1989, is that there was more and more also in art a return to a kind of thinking about memory, about nostalgia, about belatedness, about that's a massive thing, yeah, and it starts with artists, I don't know, like Kabakov or Christian Baltansky, yeah, that you have a real politics of memory emerging and a politics of belatedness. There's also the discourses of Habermas's belated catching up development and belated modernization that become en vogue in this time. I think we should try to take the former.
If you brought these practices, I mean, don't you think that they have really become dominant actually, like in the last 10 years?
In the last 10,
rather than in the
20.
In the 90s.
I think that, you know.
And this is very important. It's not just, you know, a Livresque kind of like attempt to make chronologies here, but that would make it less of a consequence of like 89. As a consequence of the failure of the first decade of after 89.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last 20 years we've definitely seen an ideology emerging to deal with a real state of affairs. We see an ideology of belatedness, formerness, nostalgia, melancholia, a kind of end of history, which was also, you know, the big topic somehow in 1989 and afterwards. This kind of post-historical malaise, if you will, spreading, and we have this as an ideology. But what we should try to do, I think, more importantly, is to see what actually happens with that former mass, yeah, this Atlantis that is sinking somehow over the last years, and what are the floods that are flooding over it, for an example, to speak very metaphorically. Yeah, we should rather try to actually understand the process itself than focus too much on the philosophy of the ideology, because I do suspect it to be an ideology. I do suspect that actually the real processes that are happening on the level of hegemony are quite different. I think that the Western languages, if you will, have not been challenged as much as some ideologues of this transformation and of the 90s, which was the more utopian time of this transformation, would have hoped. Yeah, people were hoping that, for an example, in contemporary art, the hegemony of minimalism, post-minimalist conceptualism would be challenged, and that there was somehow even physical proof of this happening. Yeah? But actually, people, if you really look at what was going on, it's actually more a universalization of some of the principles of American post-conceptualist, minimalist, conceptualist art. It's actually more that this is being used as an international language in different places. So you would find works that would be comparable, and you would find works, okay, that would challenge this, but would have the ideological function of showing this challenge and representing it. So I think that there's a complication and an entanglement, as you say.
But I'm not sure if I agree with that, because I think that this spread of the most likely American or American / Western European language occurred much earlier, occurred before the victory, occurred in the 60s.
But I think it's
and it occurred, and it wasn't even, and it was not, and this is certainly important to say, that it was not exclusively a spread of this language. It was a spread of this language that activated, interacted with, or in some cases like only marginally influenced different processes that were happening in parallel, of like different evolutions of a modernist strain in having like different lives and afterlives. And I think this spread and this universalization of a language that was quasi-complete in the 70s, I mean, sort of like spreading beyond different curtains and beyond different borders, like in relation to the West. So when the victory occurred of the West in '89, this was a reality on the ground that was found, and there were like all these stories that were like in different relations of conjunction and of divergence with like one narrative.
But I think there is, there's an illusion of the grand narrative, the great Western tradition and so forth being eroded. But actually, what you have is a set of divergences from this grand narrative that actually, in their diverging and their convergence at times, confirm that and enrich it in some ways. Universalize it, make it accessible in the way that, for an example, you have in the spread of Christianity, or in the use of the Latin language throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. You have similar processes of hybridization. You can't talk about this really challenging the hegemony of Rome until you know what I mean. Actually, I think we should be careful in too quickly sort of saying that 1989, the apparent victory of the West, has brought on this process of self-destruction, which is I'm not so sure, which I think is more of an ideology, actually. More of a way of dealing with a new situation, and less of a reality in the art world, for an example. I do not see that kind of pluralization that many people were talking about in the 90s, and I tried to explain to myself why were they making this statement.
There is a certain kind of like discourse of pluralization that happened in the 90s that did not occur, and for many of those cases, it's probably a good thing that never happened. But I'm just trying to insist on this. I mean, what you can say, and this is an indirect consequence of 1989, and this is one of the things that we want to prove in this project. I mean, what you have in terms of this historiography of art, and in terms of this discussion on canons and hierarchies. I mean, first of all, like along the tradition of the understanding of art history as basically American and Western European art history, simply not named as such, is significantly challenged and irreparably so by, for example, the proof that there was modernism in Brazil, for example. That was like the first step. And the second step, which is probably even more important, would be the proof that, well, that strain of modernism probably did not necessarily be a direct branch of a Euro-American or a Western European-American Cold War modernism, but could have like originated or had its some of its roots even in the Soviet Union and the avant-garde there. So that this history exists and are there, and this has happened, and this was
okay. But I think here there's an important moment that we should still sort of understand, that these things are reappropriated by a general system that is actually using them in a way that it recycled all kinds of things throughout its history, and that the appropriative logic that's at work here is very, very strong. So instead, I think we should talk about the transformations that are happening. I agree that the art historical canon has sort of dispersed in some ways, come back together in other ways. Definitely, this is something you can see, and you can see on a daily praxis, but at the same time you can always see just as many reaffirmations of this mythical, monolithic, modernist canon. And you can find them in the most unexpected places, actually. Sometimes in an exhibition of Brazilian modernism, you could find a reaffirmation of precisely that cleanness that we expect from this monolith. So I think we have to be more careful, and we have to also look at what happened. Maybe not so much to this West itself, which is somehow suddenly challenged in a bereft of its enemy, searching for a new enemy that it finds then in Islam, and that this is impossible somehow, and bringing us into this situation of a kind of left liberal intellectuals soul searching to see why actually and what is happening to our own identity. I think that this is important, but on the other hand, we should really look what is happening, what is this advent of global art? Because we're talking about the last 20 years, we're talking about the advent of a global art system on a totally new and unexpected scale. I think that this is something we should really fix. We're talking about a kind of industrialization of immaterial labor. We're talking about a massive shift of whole sectors of the economy that used to be non-productive into the productive realm, and of whole productive sectors that are either outsourced or that simply evaporate away. We're talking about these momentous changes, and we can't just chalk them up to a metaphysical identity crisis of the spirit. This is all I'm saying. So going from there, how do we approach this topic? What are we actually talking about when we're talking about these last 20 years, and what has actually occurred? And I think we should maybe start to think in that direction. We can have a cigarette first, but not a West cigarette.
But okay, let's try to sort of rewind, and you were mentioning all the time about what changed. Mm-hmm. Let's start from here. What changed?
You know what? I mean, obviously, we're talking about a transition from one mode of production to another, and we're talking about a process that lasts really more than for the last 20 years. It's something that begins, I would say, after World War II and goes on until today, and we're not yet through with this transition. I think what has really changed is the evaporation on the one hand, and on the other hand, a kind of internalization and a sublimation of what 20th century socialism was in reality and what it stood for. So both of those things have seemingly evaporated, but also have been internalized, have universalized, have been diffused. At the same time, you have a real spread, we're coming close to the moment where the market really seems to be a totality that is in every place, that is ubiquitous. So it's at the same time you have a key question that is often overlooked, I think, in this whole discourse of formerness, is what actually happened to these former Soviet, socialist, communist traditions. Where did they go? How were they reintegrated? How were they retooled? I think that capitalism, in its transition from one mode of capitalist production to a newer, more advanced mode of capitalist production, has actually been fueled greatly by those energies. Many of them unconscious, many of them historical, actually acting more as historical forces that never find their way to articulation.
Examples?
I would say that neoliberal corporate capitalism has often command and control structures within its corporations that are very reminiscent of the way a Stalinist command economy would work. Yeah, and you can, I think you can see how well suited authoritarian, Stalinist, post-Stalinist, Maoist legacies are in a capitalist context. That is, they're actually very profitable. It's very good in certain situations, for certain tasks, to have very, very rigid authoritarian economies and also to abolish politics.
Yeah.
The abolition of politics is something that was very successfully done, I think, through Stalinism. Yeah, this was really what Stalinism, in the end effect, managed to do for many people who were really the historical subjects behind this transformation. Yeah, The people who were actually in control of this massive historical shift were the ones who were the subjects who were made devoid of politics by this. So I think we really have to look very closely at what exactly was internalized. I think if you talk about...
how did this process of internalization happen? What were the mechanisms and what were the paths, the trajectories?
Well...
how did this... this perceived...
it's not as much about ideology as we think.
No, it's about...
It's not about
mechanisms and,
it's about
ethos.
About ethos, about social, about really existing social structures.
But how did this mutate or transferred from Stalinism to the neoliberal phase in capitalism development?
I think we can think about this kind of being part of a radically different or alternate mode of production as something that's universally spread. So you have, even among dissidents, for an example, you find a kind of... let me begin again, this is no good. There's a... okay, we're talking about, obviously we're talking about different things. We're talking on the one hand about the takeover just of elites who were working actually throughout this process, in the rest of the world, so to speak. We're talking about people who are now neoliberals, obviously, who have leftist backgrounds, and social democrat backgrounds, communist backgrounds, who suddenly then become members, for an example, of the government of Sarkozy. You have this. This is something very, very concrete and very clear that you could find out just by reading the newspapers and actually seeing like who was behind the neoliberal transformation. Well, actually, there's a kind of balance, a political balance between Reaganites, so to speak, and former Stalinists, which is kind of strange. But
and there is this history. I mean, we were talking the other day actually on the genealogy of the neocons.
Right.
That was actually like in many ways like closer to a Stalinist paradigm than even the social democrats in Western Europe of the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Or,
but there's so you have that, but you also have. It's a bit difficult to say in culture, how this works, but you can see it quite well when you look at what happens with the commodity of the former East, when it becomes part of a capitalist economy. So there's the first most obvious way is it's just a fetish. It's just a souvenir. It's a matryoshka that you open up and there's like one inside the other and it's an enigma wrapped inside a riddle and you don't really know what to do with it, so you put it on your shelf and that's it. But actually what is more interesting is when you have, in the art world, you have means of producing subjectivity that are being taken over and internalized by the art system. For an example, take the case of Ilya Kabakov and how Ilya Kabakov functioned as an artist, how he consciously actually worked with this entire Matryoshka syndrome, wrapping himself in the enigmatic figure of a false authorship and so forth, of the collector who actually was collecting nothing, the man who could never throw anything away but who was collecting really valueless things and turning them into something that would have a real value as well, a symbolic value as contemporary art. So this would be the first phase of formerness. The second phase, actually, which is much more interesting, is when you find traces of Kabakov in elm green and drag sets. when you find that mode of producing subjectivity, which has very little to do with the traditional collector as he would be in, the former West, but you have a completely new, crazy kind of collecting that's going on in their work, for an example. an appropriation of this idea of the total installation, which is obviously a very Soviet idea, a very Stalinist idea almost. So you have these those are some of the shifts that would interest me more, is how does suddenly this massive experience become reappropriated? How is it taken apart? How is it retooled? And what actually remains of it? Do we look at that as a kind of perspective for a change, for a renewal of this mode of production that is becoming more advanced through that? Do we hang on to those things and say, yes, thank God, if we're engaged for this kind of change? Or do we say that actually this is part of the problem, that it was almost like the socialist regimes, especially in their last phase, were preparing this mode, this transition? So, to me, this is a really important question. I think, in some ways, it links in to other questions.
How does this affect the story of the West? How does this play home in the field of the West? How does this alter that narrative?
I think it alters it quite drastically, and not only because of this superficial kind of thing that I was talking about as an example. Because what you see actually is now you see repoliticization of art without politics, for an example, which is a very strange phenomenon that can only happen after this kind of momentous transformation. So that actually something that was really part of the mode of the socialist 20th century socialist mode of production, which is in a way not a distinct but a transitional mode of production too, like what we have now, actually. In this you see. Okay, I lost my thread here. Is there any way to stop the camera?
In two different directions.
At once. Yeah. I remember. Okay. So a part of the Can we?
Sure.
Yeah. So a part of the socialist mode of production in the 20th century was really how to use politics of people, of individuals, to create a bigger agency that would then possibly also contradict what these people were actually working for. So in the case of Soviet industrialization, for an example, if you take that, a great, if you look at what actually fueled this industrialization, one big part of that was actually that there were people who were really engaged for this project and who were really working very hard, self-organizing, to the point of even prisoners in the Gulag self-organizing. Okay, so this is really like a part of this. At the same time, it has this drastic effect of killing politics. Then, at some point, really physically killing the people who did this. So the way of how to instrumentalize people's political energies that they would put into something, how they would be self-organized, engaged in a project, in a grander project. This is something that has resurfaced in a strange way under neoliberalism, a kind of legacy, if you will, shining through. This is something you can see also in contemporary art in a very clear way. Because actually what you see is these projects of relational aesthetics that somehow are reminding of, and representing a kind of self-organizational drive.
Yeah,
you have a rhetorics of this new spirit of capitalism, self-organized, engaged, even political. Political for what? Not for the, the elimination of capitalism or the intensification of class struggle, although sometimes you find among artists, strangely enough, after 1989, in a whole new wave of repoliticizations that started in the late 90s and continued through the 2000s, sort of our formative years in a way, you see a resurfacing of this kind of rhetorics, and you see a system that is very carefully eliminating politics, actually neutralizing them, and at the same time using the energies of these people to build this new hegemony that is creating a very plausible front of socially responsible, politicized, even leftist capitalism. And this is being sold to us as a transition from one mode of production that was obviously flawed and where people could obviously be against it, to a position where resistance is not so obvious and cannot be obvious anymore. I think that's what I mean, and that's what I'm really trying to get at. You know, you have, on the one hand, you have these artifacts of really existing socialism. They were marketed, became tools somehow. But on the other hand, you have a real resurfacing of certain things that were not possible in that capitalism in the same way, that are now becoming a kind of... And it's a scary picture, because you think about what happened in 1937 in the Soviet Union with this, massive industrialization, and how people were discarded. And I often think that, of course we don't live in such a tragic time in that way, or the tragedy has been outsourced, it's been put somewhere else so that we don't see it, we don't face the risk of being put in gulags, but actually we are in some ways being captured in the same kind of exploitative loops, while thinking that we're actually working toward the hegemony of the right thing, that we're really reforming the system, that we're really changing things, that we're really making the hegemony completely porous and eroding the canon, while actually we're, just exerting ourselves for that system. Maybe it's a slightly paranoid idea, but I think there's something to that.
Assuming that such a machinery is there, how long can it run like this?
That's a good question. I think that the immediate post-communist era is almost over, or maybe it has in fact already ended, so that resource is very finite, and you feel it actually in the more finite it becomes in some ways, the more hard it becomes to really find fetishes anyway. It's almost impossible to find that actually have some real fetish value.
Yeah.
So
fetish is always the indicator.
Fetishes are always the indicator for how much is still there. You have also with the kind of... I mean, if you look at contemporary Russia and how many things in Russia today are reminiscent of Stalinism, which is kind of crazy, yeah? You see that there, after maybe 2 generations, that this will mutate again into something different. Perhaps even, ending this neutralization of politics, maybe in some really unexpected way. I don't know. But I see that a flat-out kind of straight repoliticization often has the effect of complicity, and that this is a structure that we see emerging. That this terrifying complicity of people who have been repoliticized by the last 20 years, and at the same time are growing into structures that are obviously very nicely using them for representative purposes that go way outside and beyond those structures. That whole experience is something that we see historically arising now. My hypothesis, that they could be very paranoid as to why this is happening. It's all the fault of Stalinism. It's all the fault of an untrue kind of false understanding of Marxism or something like this. But I think that process is objective.
And how is this playing out in the former West?
In the former West? You mean like in Berlin or in Germany?
In Berlin, in Köln, more than Berlin, in London, in New York, in Milwaukee?
Yeah, it's a kind of class struggle without classes. I mean, it's a very strange phenomenon. You have a bourgeois bohemian intelligentsia often appropriating images of the early 30s or late 20s and having a self-image of engagement that is completely not focused around anything but maybe a single issue or a small set of issues, but that sees itself as an agent in a total transformation. The total transformation is there, but it's just going in a completely opposite direction. And I think that's the tragedy of the left, that was prepared in some ways. Throughout the 60s and 70s and the 50s, it was already a problem. And this kind of splittering happens all the time. But you see, it's very fashionable and very chic and very sexy to be a communist, but it's a communism that doesn't, like with this idea of communism conference that you had of Badiou and Zizek, you see that not you had, but they had. Tickets are going for, I don't know, 50 euros or whatever.
£90 a day.
And it was a lot of money, and you had people who were going there like to a party meeting, yes. And it's really a nice business. I mean, so as a Marxist, I look at this and feel, on the one hand ashamed, but on the other hand kind of proud because, they're doing a good, it's a good business somehow, but. But this is the kind of changes that I'm talking about, because actually the speeches that you would hear at a congress like that would be, about an intensification of class struggle, but without classes, without any kind of class consciousness of any kind of enemy other than the faceless monolithic corporation, where we are exactly confirming that kind of West that you are claiming to be former. So, this is the kind of strange situation we're in somehow, I think. I think it's very important today to ask, how do you get beyond that? How do you get outside of that? How do you get beyond a kind of pose of mourning and weeping? I think, I can't, of course, I don't have an answer to that. My first hypothesis was that you have to be engaged, which obviously has given rise to these deliberations. So I don't think that there's any other way. I don't remember where this is from, but I think it was some Christian saint who said that there is no salvation outside of the party, outside of the church. So outside of the party, this is very Stalinist reasoning. Actually, you're nothing. So you have to continue. You have to be part of that system. But what do you do there, and how? What do you fight for? Actually, it's a very important question. So one thing to fight for an example, is really that people that you try to analyze what is happening to capitalism and what is happening to its economy of time, for an example. How do you intervene in that? It's not just a question about making a frontal attack on power and revealing how power on the one hand is not a monolith, but on the other hand is, a disgusting thing, because it's actually all these different little nasty things coming together that control you. Yeah? This is something that in some ways is obvious and remains obvious. One can work with these obviousnesses, but I think what's maybe more important is to develop to develop a sensibility for how do you say this, to shift those terms of debate within, and to understand what is actually happening with all this time that is being spent on art. That's also another new thing, I think. I think that how the economy of time has evolved, and how much time people are putting into art. Massive audiences, new audiences are coming to this. What are you giving to these people to waste their time on? How are you working in that, and who's actually being exploited? These are the kind of questions you have to ask, I think. And it really comes down to an interesting kind of replay of an orthodox Marxist discussion.
But this is a bit sort of like an explanation that is like too much confined to the realm of art.
Maybe.
If we take it outside.
I think we're still talking. I mean, this is one of the key features of what has happened over the last 20 years, or the last 30 years, is you have a massive transformation in that particular sphere, and I think it's not limited to art. at all. I mean, how do you explain something like the 5 hours a day many people are using on YouTube? How do you talk about that? How do you look at that? You know, it's more interesting to look at the time and the self-abstracting time people spend on social media than to look at the political causes that they're pursuing.
A form of creativity. You're like going to Mr. Groys now.
No, maybe not as a form of creativity. It's often just blank time, nothing time, time spent asserting something. You know, this is an unbelievable thing. Where does this time come from?
Why isn't that a form of manifesting creativity? I mean,
it doesn't. It could be. It doesn't have to be. The question is, you know, how do you? I mean, this formerness, okay, of the West that we started talking about. One of its key elements is so that in the West, people used to work. There were industries, there were workers, there were people who grew up with an ethos of work, 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 and keep working until you drop dead. And if you go on the pension, it's the most terrible thing that could actually happen to you, because then you really get sick and die. So there's this idea, the formerness actually would be like, now the West is on vacation. There's no more work going on. You either study in university, or you're a pensioner, or you're working in a service industry, or you're a freelancer, which is creativity, right? You're working in the service industry. There you already get closer to actually what we're talking about. You're serving someone who has your time is not free time. You're serving someone who is on vacation. So you have that actually stepping into the center. As Marx's favorite quote was, the true wealth of a society is disposable time and nothing more. Yeah? And this is I think very interesting change that's going on. So we can talk. I mean, we really I think spend too little time thinking about that. We spend too little time discussing actually where does all this disposable time to have these long conferences, to go to Documenta and to watch all the videos. And this is not something that is our strictly professional privilege. Actually, the spread of that mode of spending free time is our job somehow. So what are we actually doing by doing that? And if, you know, there you have to choose, but it's a very careful political choice, I think, sometimes. How do you deal with it? But I think it would be one interesting way to refocus that question, not to say, you know, okay, globalization. This globalization is a process that is happening. It's objective. We can't, you know, just ignore it. But I don't think we should structure a discourse of formerness around geopolitical categories. I think it would be much more interesting to take, for an example, economies of time. And that ties into this whole idea of like the appropriation of a Soviet resource, because actually one of the things that all of this Soviet culture that is being swallowed by a neoliberal economy, either as a fetish or as, you know, this kind of more productive tool, comes from that, grows on the incredible wealth of the Soviet Union in the 70s and the 80s, that was still there, that was as a kind of, that ensured that you didn't have to actually work that much because the productivity was high enough to keep some minimum of living. People were spending a lot of time just on, you know, nothing, reading Hegel, you know. And this to me is a question like, what happened to that time? Where does that go? Why are people now, they're not spending time reading Hegel, they're going to the Documenta and spending their time there. And there we find some very interesting things where it becomes possible maybe to intervene, to get people to spend their free time, you know, I don't know, fetishistically reading Capital. You know, it would be good. And I mean, this is like where my kind of reasoning leads. I don't think that, I think we have to fight for time more and more. And I think that that's where we kind of find again these kind of messianic possibilities, weak messianic possibilities or something. Yeah, but this is not, so that would be one place. Sorry if that goes too far, but
no, I think it's
I think it's important not to talk about geopolitics so much. because they become important from the focus of that question. You know, the disposable time that we have here, the free time we have here, is made in China.
Absolutely, and this is also, you know, I mean, going back to the previous discussion, I mean, this also reveals basically that it's not well. I mean, this is an outsourcing also of the classes, and it's an outsourcing of the class structure of a society that is, and of an economy that is not anymore confined in the borders of a nation state.
But is art? Let me ask you a question. If free time becomes, I mean, just to see the process that we have here, we have a transition from a mode of production that produces free time to a mode of production that actually uses free time to be more productive. So you see all kinds of micro productivities, actually in some cases not so micro productivities, that are arising on an entire economy of free time. So that actually some people are working, you know, exclusively. Like in China, you have people who are sitting in basements playing computer games so that somebody on the other side of the world will have a live, not artificial intelligence working against them. In a situation...
Is that really happening?
Yeah. In a situation like that, if art is based on free time, which is actually the case, yeah? Because art is something that can only happen actually in this kind of regime. It's not possible to just produce art. This has been something that people have been talking about since the 18th century.
Yes.
That production and the industrial mode of production, kind of the hunger of capitalism for time devours art and leaves little of it that would remain valid just because nobody has time to actually look at it, nobody has time to deal with it. So, at the risk of essentializing this question, I would really ask, like, is it possible in a regime where where everything is based on this accumulation of wealth, on older wealth of disposable time, is it actually possible to have a real art where time is timeless? And to me, it's really, really plaguing me, this question, because I think that that's one of the changes that becomes really apparent in the last 10 years, is you have, as a representation, you have free time. As a reality, it's disappearing under the pressure of, I have to write another blog entry, I don't actually have time to look at this stuff. You know, and so it's this very strange thing that you don't have time to make art, you don't have time to look at art, yet it's this massive time that's somehow there. What is that? You know, this is something we have to, I think, really tackle. And it's not just about, you know, what is that wonderful Sarat Maharaj's metaphor about the flood in the Parthenon? You know this? Yeah. It's not just about that. There's something that's going on.
The Congo.
Yeah. The Congo is flooding the Parthenon. I think we would be much better, in a much better position if we looked in that direction, not in the direction of the global shift, because I think actually the agency, the real agency of contemporary art, aside from its kind of, being the classical kind of tool of representation of a bourgeoisie, is actually taking people, putting them to work on a certain project also of enlightenment, of course, of creating a school for politics, where there are no politics, which is a very strange thing, yeah? What is that, and where does that come from? And I think here we could trace a genealogy from the utopian 90s to the more normalized 2000s and beyond, seeing that economy emerging and seeing it kind of crystallize out of a place where, before there was just, kind of numb watching of the TV, which is also a kind of interesting way to spend your free time.
It's a good point.
Do you need a pause to think of another next question?
No, we don't go out. No, I'm thinking like where should we... you're very vignetted somehow in the expression of your ideas. So it's very different than the other interview somehow, because it's not so much, you don't need to be...
No, but you need to prompt the next kind of, to refocus it around something else maybe. I mean, there are other shifts that are happening obviously too, that you have, for an example, if you want to talk about, continue talking about these changes that have been taking place. I mean, we can talk about deterritorialization over the last 20 years and how massively that has affected. And I don't mean necessarily just this, happy story of, the Western canon being challenged. I mean, actually, people really losing the kind of ground under their feet and being thrown into radically different situations, being thrown onto labor markets and so forth. Yeah, and that happens to artists too. It happens. That is a really massive change that you can see in those years, with new kind of subjectivities emerging. We could also talk about.
Well, I mean, where? I mean, you're talking now about the sort of like transition in the former Soviet Union.
No, I'm also. I think I'm also. I think this is something that we can also talk about as a ubiquitous wave of a complete reshuffling, which is actually why I think that it's more important to look at the time factor than the spatial or the geopolitical factor, because actually you have new subjects emerging that are completely ripped out of this kind of context, that actually don't have as little claim to this, let's say, this bipolar world, the West and the rest, that can't locate themselves in either one, that are floating around as agents of a new hegemony. And we have to look at this deterritorialization as something that affects both sides. So you have appearance of massive migrant worker from Pakistan to Dubai, or I don't know, within China, migrant workers, and then on the other hand you have Hans Ulrich Obrist. You could make a bleep over the speech of the naming of curators, but you have the global curator, who is also ripped out of his context and is spending his time in the airport lounge. So how do you deal with those things? And again, it comes down to time and the lack thereof, which is actually very interesting, and the complete erosion or shifting of those cultural identities. But I think you also this again to me is a kind of prerequisite, and we have to look more closely and see what actually happens within the result, and where is that leading? Give me some cues, man. I'm like running out of ideas here. Let's take a cigarette break, and you think about where to lead this, because we should go for like another 15 minutes, and that's it.
Yeah.
And then there will definitely be enough to cut things from this. Although I feel sort of irresponsibly just rambling, because you have to tell me.
No, it was great so far. There was absolutely no reason for me to intervene here. I would want to sort of like place this more on a kind of on a historical background, and I would want to sort of like I would insist to sort of like have a geopolitical equation behind, because I agree that this is like a very precious very fertile sort of like methodology that you propose, but exactly because of that, I would want to see this sort of like in a geopolitical equation. Because it is not completely independent from that.
But what's interesting...
And it is, and we mentioned, I mean, there were like sort of like small moments when you mentioned China, and you mentioned the outsourcing as a footnote, but it's not a footnote. I mean, it's a central story in this equation.
But it's
and
not so simple. One of the big problems is that it's not so simple that you just have,
It's not so simple to put it on a map and leave the story.
And the problem
but
is
you cannot just leave it out.
It's not so simple that the people who are producing our, like the old Marxist equation, is that disposable time until capitalism ends, disposable time will always have the blood stain, of exploitation. That somebody is, for you to be sitting here painting your Mona Lisa, somebody is out there, like really, dying for this to happen. It's still that way, but what you have a very strange thing happening. For an example, I mentioned these sweatshops, these virtual sweatshops. It's actually in Asia. I read about a whole big thing about this. That in Asia, in Korea, in China, in the Pearl River Delta, there's a lot of this. Actually, you have people who are enacting precisely that rendering productive of their free time. So it's as an alternative of going to work in a manufacturing plant and making buttons or whatever, making toys or making watches. Everything is made in the Pearl River Delta. So you have actually the option to be like, an happy-go-lucky teenager who plays only computer games. So does no manual labor, but who does that like 24 hours in a row, hooked up to a gaming server, so that, a Dutch kid could play Call of Duty or whatever, the shooter, or to play in a role-playing game. So it's not so simple that you would have, like one part of the world is, like in an old kind of imperialist thinking, one part of the world is underdeveloped and their resources are just being taken away. But it's actually that the resources of free time are being, that suddenly you have this free time from China being put into this and made operable. So that is, I think to contemporary art, quite relevant. You have somebody in Argentina who's willing to spend 3 years on a project. And that 3 years is taken and brought into a situation where it's used in a representative way, but where it's also expected that the audience must spend the necessary time. The curator doesn't spend the time, the critic doesn't spend the time, the artist maybe doesn't even spend the time, but makes a fake and says that it was 3 years of working. So I think that in those geopolitical contexts, we have to be sure that we understand the complexity of this unevenness. On the one hand, you do have this outsourcing, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean that the so-called periphery is not being taken over. In fact, it's even more being taken over by these shifts. And they're much more drastic and much more radical, which goes back to what I was saying before, that in the so-called former Rest, you often see the dominant mode of production flare up in its most, grandiosely crazy way, which you don't, here people are more sort of former, I guess, and trying, to keep that in a civilized form. So you don't have, the burnout level is not as high.
Okay, but in this model that you presented, and now I'm apparently sort of like countering your point, the geographical distinctions cannot be drawn so clearly, because it is not any, of course there is the main difference that you mentioned between the former imperial West, that was like drawing resources from the colonies and sort of like maintaining like huge, vast swaths of territories for, like a monoculture and one resource and so on. And that is different today now, like because like what is being traded on one hand is the free time from that. But it's not anymore a question of like the West drawing these resources. I mean, these resources circulate on other levels as well. There are the people in China that consume these games.
Exactly.
And there might be
There are
very well like
working-
artists in the former West actually like investing those 3 years for a consumer in Korea.
Right. Could be, yeah.
And how does this play on the former West? Because on one hand you disagree that this destabilization is valid, but you agree that these transfers are happening.
I don't disagree that.
Can this simply be explained through a deterritorialization of a still existing structure of the West? Or is it more attentive?
Well, the structure changes obviously when it's deterritorialized, but I think we have to. I think the kind of world system theory of approach of that there's a very definite center, a semi-periphery and a periphery, is it has its flaws. Let's put it like that. And with those flaws, I think that's where we should begin, because actually, to me, it's unclear that that was ever, since the 50s or so, whether that was really the case ever. I think, yeah, of course, in that way, we are rethinking. Everybody has been rethinking this because those systems just don't work somehow. But of course, I mean, there are places in the world where people and there are entire, peoples, or I mean, there are entire groups, there's really, I mean, you look at a Tajik migrant worker in Moscow who, not only doesn't have time to look at art, but would never, even if he had time, would never even consider the option. You can talk to people and, they will tell you that this is the furthest thing from their minds. And their work is actually, of course, producing that in the long run. Of course, that's there. But I think to just focus on that inequality is to not understand why this is happening and how this is happening in a broader scheme. Because actually what becomes interesting is, okay, so Tajik migrant worker, let's take that as a case. I had a very interesting conversation in a taxi in Moscow, where I'm talking to a guy who started out actually on a construction site and then made enough money to buy a car. So this is like the crazy Western narrative of success, yeah, and then managed. So he saved up and he got enough money to bring his family. The family came to Moscow. He was working as a taxi driver. He was from Tajikistan. And he made enough money to buy not only a car, but his main pride was that his kids had a cheapo notebook computer where they were watching YouTube and where they were blogging and where they're learning to write through the computer. No, I was amazed because this guy is telling me, and we're discussing the nuances of what provider you should use, and and I'm thinking, okay, this is how fluid, this is what's actually going on, is that you can no longer say that there is a lumpen proletariat, for an example, who has no access to any of this. Because you get on the train and you see this lumpen proletariat with an iPhone, surfing the internet. And you see the possibility is there. You see them, you could even find them standing in line to go look at a Biennale. What they do there and how they spend their time there is a different question. So what becomes very important from the side of the system and from the institutions is that they then have the role of kind of modulating that and taking these people and saying, well, you should spend your time, not standing here and pointing your finger and laughing, but you should actually spend your time reading the annotation, then you understand that there's maybe not so much to laugh about here and so forth. So this kind of that's also, again, what I'm talking about the renewal of a kind of coercive, quite dominant position in all of this, of a hegemony. It comes through that too. You have suddenly new subjects in a situation who are being coerced into spending their time in a certain way. Also reminds me of the 1930s, where you suddenly had, people who had just been collectivized learning to read and write, and yeah, here is your free time. Use it properly so that you will be usable for the system on the whole. I sometimes feel that way as an art critic.
Is there something else you would like to add or to ask?
Only that if you asked me the same question tomorrow, I would probably say something completely different, because
then we redo the interview
every day until we come closer to the truth.
Until we come closer to the truth.
Yes, I think the best thing that one could do in a project like Former West is really to postpone everything. You know, just postpone everything. Postpone the exhibition, postpone the need for new representative moments, and try to really analyze, because you need, this is, I think, kind of the end of what I'm saying. We've been talking about time, we've been taking time to talk about time, which is kind of silly. But, you know, my kind of appeal would be to really take the time to ask, what is this? Because otherwise it gets stuck in an ideological hall of mirrors, where it's always a subject looking at a monolith, seeing himself in the reflection of the monolith. You know, this is like, this doesn't lead very far. It then leads, because if you're a subject, and most subjects are subaltern subjects, yeah? Most subjects are slaves and not masters. If they see themselves in the mirror, they just reproduce the same subalternity. Yeah. There's a question of how do we move beyond that, and I think it's too easy, you know. To get beyond that, you need time. So we would need another 2 hours. We would need another 5 hours, and then we would be, you know, putting more water, and maybe we would be more successful then, because we would putting more water on the mill of neo-capitalism, which has an insatiable hunger for this time, needs it. Maybe people should stop. You know?
Super.
Okay.